So welcome everybody. This is the share-out meeting for the two task teams. And the purpose of this meeting was for the two task teams to come together to present the research that they have produced up to this point in the process. We also invited the executive committee members and also the members of the Planning and Priorities Committee. And our reason for doing that was just that we wanted to include them in the process, and also so they would have the same background information when they go to make their decisions that we had in our thinking. So how this is going to be structured is that Task Team 2 is going to begin. They're going to do a series of 3 presentations that are going to last approximately 20 minutes. After each presentation, there will be a follow-up question and answer period that's really intended for clarifying questions or comments. And we're going to save the real in-depth discussion of the entire process, or not of the process, but of all of the factors till the end after all 5 of the presentations. So we'll go through the 5 presentations, then we will have discussions among the task teams. And I should say up to that point, the participation will be primarily for the task team members, right? And after that, after we've completed discussion, then audience members will be invited to share their comments or questions. Yeah? So are there any questions at this point? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. First up is a presentation on structures at other institutions by Derek Milne from the Anthropology Department. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. You can hear me okay? Okay. I have a PowerPoint presentation to go with our report, which I think Matt has made the report available to everyone, the kind of preliminary findings that our research group were kind of compiled. But if you haven't had time to look that report over, I will synopsize it today, and you can refer to that document. You're welcome to take notes from this presentation, but basically the contents of this presentation are available in that report. So you don't necessarily have to write anything down if you don't want to. Okay. Coming to a screen near you. I do. It's up. Okay. We are the Other Institutions Realignment Research Group. We had a number, but I'm forever forgetting what that number is, so we'll just go with this today. And my research group included the following people: Lori Burress from VAMS, Yu-Chung Chang from Math, Carol Curtis from Languages, Krista Gogan from the Library, Dan Haley from the Library, Wendy Lee from Natural Sciences, Simonetta May from Languages, myself, Derek Milne from Social Sciences, and finally Roland Percy from VAMS. I think I speak for everyone in our research group by saying thank you for the opportunity to have done this work, and as well as thank you for being here today and hearing some of our results. It's been a pleasure being part of this process, and I know I've learned a lot, and I think the other members of my research group feel the same way. Okay. Now, our methods were to examine comparable institutions to PCC and look at their administrative structures. So what we did was to do research on comparably sized California community colleges. Many of us had experience teaching at other community colleges besides Pasadena City College, and we drew on that experience. We also selected the community colleges for our sample that were the most similar to PCC in terms of their size, but also we decided to restrict our sample to California and not actually study community colleges outside of California. To do the research, individual committee members were assigned or volunteered for institutions. People tended to choose the institutions that they were familiar with because sometimes that actually helped in the research process. In some cases, however, individuals were simply assigned institutions from our sample. We utilized online resources, which were varied greatly in terms of their usefulness. We also did telephone and email communication. We did not do site visits to any of the colleges that we were studying. That sort of level of work was kind of beyond the capacity of the committee. So this is based on communication and information that was either available on the web or that we requested from human resource departments or individuals that we knew at these different colleges. The institutions that we researched are listed here on the display. We researched Santa Monica College, Santa Ana College, Mount SAC, Long Beach City College, El Camino College, Sacramento City College, Orange Coast College, Cerritos College, Santa Barbara City College, Glendale Community College, and finally College of the Canyons in Santa Clarita. We researched a number of variables to the best of our ability, and those included the basic administrative structure of each of those colleges, as well as the number, size, structure of divisions and departments, or departments, depending on what the structure of the individual college was. We also researched the hiring, the roles and the duties of division deans and or department chairs if they had both or either. We looked at those roles and duties. And finally, we looked at the procedures to appoint and elect deans and chairs, as well as the system of compensation that's used at the different colleges. And there was some information that was difficult to find, and we did our best to kind of systematically produce the same information for all of the colleges that we looked at, but ultimately there were some holes here and there in what we were able to discover. Okay. Now, originally, the task team number 2, which is the first one you're hearing from today, was charged with looking at the question of sort of deans versus chairs. And just to kind of start with that, deans are, as you probably know, full-time administrators. They typically are selected by a committee of people. They're hired by a committee of people with faculty input and generally administrative input as well, and usually administrative final say in terms of the hiring of deans. Okay, you're familiar with this system because it's our own. Chairs, on the other hand, which don't come with a martini, are part or full-time individuals. They receive stipends, reassigned time, or both, and they are almost always selected by a faculty vote. Okay. At different colleges, compensation formulas for chairs vary a great deal. It really depends on the amount of responsibility they have, and this is a contract issue, obviously, that is negotiated with unions. But different colleges have very, very different compensation formulas and schedules, some of which include, obviously, release time, and others include a stipend. Now, for our presentation today, essentially what we discovered when we looked at the different colleges was that there is what you could call a spectrum that ranges from an administrative system that is much more departmentally focused on the one hand, to, on the other end of the spectrum, an administrative structure that is much more dean focused. And what we decided to do, rather than looking at it as a spectrum, because that gets kind of messy, was to actually break the spectrum down into 4 different models that have slightly different emphases, and then talk about each of these models, as well as mention some of the examples of each of the models, and finally to talk about their relative strengths and weaknesses as we could see them, okay? Now, there's a few things to say about that. First of all, we are a faculty committee, so even though we were trying to be objective in this, the presentation is a presentation from the faculty perspective. And you might say that faculty perspective is in a sense the bias of the presentation. But that being said, all of us attempted to have a very open mind toward this. I think we all did have an open mind from the beginning of the process. None of us were necessarily inherently against changing our current system. We had a variety of experiences with it, as all of you have had. We talked about these experiences. We talked about with our fellow faculty and with each other. We weren't inherently against change, and we weren't inherently for change. So we tried to be neutral in that sense. But when I talk about strengths and weaknesses of each system, understand that I'm talking about those strengths and weaknesses from the perspective of the faculty. You may get a different perspective from an administrator when it comes to looking at these kinds of strengths and weaknesses. Okay, model number 1 we call Deans Without Chairs. And model number 1 is a system of divisions that encompass wide or various scholastic areas, but do not have departmental structures, okay? This may sound familiar to you because it is essentially the system that we have at PCC currently. When I say encompass wide or various scholastic areas, we have to be sort of careful here because obviously there are a great deal of differences between a division like social sciences, which has many constituent parts, and a division like English, which is, you might say, a little bit more monolithic in its nature. So there are different issues with different divisions, obviously enough. But we'll get into some of those when we talk about strengths and weaknesses, okay? Examples of this type of model, number 1, Deans Without Chairs. We are not actually alone in this structure. When we started out the process, I was unfamiliar, even though I've taught at about 5 community colleges with any others that had this system. But what we found is that not only we have it, but also El Camino College, Orange Coast College, and Citrus College, which actually has recently moved from a department-based model to this system, right? So that's something you might want to bear in mind, okay? Now, the strengths of this model include that deans are a more centralized authority than department chairs typically are, okay? And this, of course, as you can imagine, has its pluses and minuses. Deans usually come from faculty ranks, which we see as a strength, we as the faculty. In this system, a dean as a centralized authority seems to be better able to kind of keep the peace between faculty, and that is one of the pluses of this system. Departmental structures, from what we hear anecdotally from the people we talked with, can result in more faculty squabbling because you've got a greater sort of dispersal of the administration. Of course, the demands on the faculty are theoretically lessened, right? Now, this is going to vary between divisions and vary across schools, but the dean takes care of a lot of things that in a departmental system would become the responsibility of the faculty. You know, faculty vary a great deal on how much responsibility they want. Some faculty don't want to do anything that's administrative. They wouldn't do it if you held them at gunpoint. But others want that responsibility. So I put this up as a strength, but of course there are two sides to every bullet point, okay? It appears that the strength of this model is that developing a department structure would potentially cost money, which in an era of austerity is a very real question for our college to consider. That being said, our research group did not concern itself with trying to systematically investigate the different costs of the relative models, the different models I'll be talking about today. So I can't state this unequivocally as a fact. I think this is more sort of in the purview of administration. Budgets and that kind of thing aren't so much my thing. But it does seem that developing a departmental structure in addition to a dean-heavy system like Model 1 would essentially cost you additional money. Finally, ultimately, you can argue, at least from the administration's perspective, that administration maintains greater control over deans than they do over chairs. Because chairs are elected by fellow faculty, but deans are ultimately beholden to the administration and hired by the administration, that gives the administration control over them. Again, whether this is actually a plus or minus really depends on your perspective. The weaknesses of this model include that deans cannot be trained in all of the areas that they administer. This simply is impossible in a division like mine, where you have a great deal of variety within a large division. Because there's no departmental structure in a system like this, departments function informally. And that becomes a rather haphazard system for departmental and program needs. What you end up with is a situation where volunteers are the ones who end up taking on a great deal of this work, while other people that don't volunteer don't. And I refer to that as volunteerism in terms of the problem that it presents. It may also be a problem that the centralized authority of deans means that they control resources individually, which can result in what shall I say, pet faculty of deans being rewarded with available resources, something we might call regime effect, at least in some cases. Obviously, you hire a dean to make good judgments on those matters, but in reality, the resource distribution being controlled by one person can lend itself to these kinds of problems. Finally, faculty and administration may differ enormously on what actually makes a good dean. A dean that's very popular with their own faculty may be decidedly unpopular with the administration of the college that they're working at. Okay, so that's something else to bear in mind. Now, model number 2 is numerous departments under a relatively larger number of division deans. I should say with the first model that other colleges like PCC that have that system very typically have the same number of deans or instructional divisions that our college has. So we don't have an excessive number of deans compared to other colleges that have the same model that we do, model number 1. We seem very comparable in numbers from what I could see from the ones that we studied. Okay. Now, model number 2 is departments under a large number of deans, and you can think of this as sort of like our system, but with another layer of departments added underneath this. Okay. And this is similar to the PCC system, but with departmental structure underneath. The departments are typically small, they vary in size, and they're run by faculty. And this is the most extensive system of all of the 4 models that I'll be looking at today. Okay, so this is the one where you have the most administrators overall across the different levels of administration. Okay. And that's something to bear in mind as well. Examples include Cerritos College and Santa Monica College, it should say, not Santa Monica City College. There are fewer of this kind of college, but in certain ways the model seems to be ideal. Now, the strengths include, of course, obviously greater involvement of faculty in the departmental structure. The programs and departments' needs can be better addressed by those faculty members who are knowledgeable in the various areas where they are conducting this kind of programming. That in turn leads to faculty input increasing without actually the loss of the current system's advantages. Okay? Now, the weaknesses, the obvious one is cost, because you've got more administrators and that's going to cost more money. And thus, this might be a system we see less and less of as the California state budget does its thing. You might also argue that a system like this has a higher degree of administrative redundancy. That is to say that this may not be the most streamlined system, okay? And that, of course, relates to cost. There are also some weaknesses that are sort of more obvious in the next model I want to talk about that apply to some extent to this one, but more strongly to Model 3. So just bear that in mind as what I would call mini departments with so-called superdeans, okay? The term superdean was absolutely unknown to me, except for I always referred to Amy Ulmer as a superdean. And once the realignment discussion started, you heard this term all the time, superdeans, superdeans, superdeans. And it got to the point where I was literally telling faculty in my division that, you know, there really is no such thing as a superdean. It isn't an actual position per se. But I decided to go ahead and use this semi-objectionable term here in the presentation, just because I think conceptually people understand what it means. So model number 3 is where you have many departments, one for the equivalent of each program. So to use social sciences, which is my own division, you would have a department of anthropology, a department of sociology, you know, a department of psychology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why I say we're talking about a model with many, many departments. And this exists under a reduced number of deans, hence the super, okay? So the reduced number of deans. The examples of this type of college include the recently embattled Santa Barbara City College, College of the Canyons, where I formerly taught, Riverside City College, Santa Ana City College, and Mount Sac. So this is a very common structure, actually, among the sample that we looked at. Department size varies greatly, but individual programs is the priority, and in general, in this group, the department numbers are very high, okay? The strengths for this type of department include that you have direct supported faculty control over programs and departments, okay? You know, compensated for with release time and such. The weaknesses, of course, include the increase in the faculty workload, the quasi-administrator, quasi-colleague role of chairs has the potential to create tension between faculty members, which just, again, in informal conversations I've had with other faculty members, this is something that's frequently brought up as a potential problem in this sort of system, something people are kind of dreading about potentially moving toward a superdean model. The faculty, it's also often asserted, although again, the reports are mixed from other colleges, but this potentially creates the possibility that the faculty voice in administration is potentially weakened, not in the direct administration of programs, but in the higher levels of administration. And this is a concern that's been raised in our conversations with faculty here on this campus about changing our current system to one that's potentially more like this. Finally, rotating and possibly mandatory chair positions require retraining. Mandatory chair positions where every member of a faculty in a program mandatorily have to serve as a chairperson for their program is spoken about with a great deal of dread among many of my colleagues who have no interest in this and would consider it something like a death sentence, essentially. And also, but just even you know, setting that aside, the willingness of the faculty to actually do it, it is the case that by rotating chair positions in this way, you do have to retrain individuals who would take over the job, and that would be a sort of form of administrative redundancy. Okay. Model 4 is larger departments run by super chairs, which is a term I coined myself. Hopefully I'll get some credit for that someday. And here we have a system where there are division-like departments, okay? And this raises an important issue that was something that in a way was a bit confusing in our research, and that is that, you know, at some colleges, you have people that are called vice presidents here called deans. And you have people who are called deans here called chairs. So the question isn't so much what the responsibilities of the position is, as to, in some cases, merely semantics as to what it's called, and also, of course, the compensation that goes along with the position. And that's the real difference. And you kind of have to bear that in mind, because if you're caught up in the terminology a bit too much, it can actually be rather confusing. Okay? In this system, what you've got is something called departments that are really closer to what we have as divisions. Okay? Examples include Glendale Community College, Long Beach City College, and Riverside City College in our sample. It's also PCC's former system. If you're not aware of the history of our institution, the deans here used to be called chairs, and they were elevated. This involved, obviously, some additional administrative duties at the time, but we used to be on this particular model, as I'm calling it, the super chair model. Okay? Chairs are full-time or extremely nearly full-time administrators. Sometimes they sort of have 80% release or something like this, but they're very nearly full-time administrators. It's essentially similar to model number 3, but with larger departments. And these department chairs that run these large departments may answer to deans, or they may answer to vice presidents. They answer to some upper level of administration. In some cases, both of them exist, but usually it's only one. So they answer to either deans and/or vice presidents, but it's usually or and not and. Okay, the strengths and weaknesses of this model include that you have faculty control over an elected administrator, because the chairs in this situation are elected by other faculty, so they retain control of that situation. Of course, the lower cost would be pointed out, that these department chairs, even when they're managing a very large department, are not compensated to the same extent that a dean is, so the compensation is lower, which of course is going to be attractive perhaps to faculty, not so much attractive to administration, but not so much to faculty. It also has some sort of secondary effects I'd like to mention. One of them is that it can be quite difficult to administer a large department, particularly if you retain some teaching responsibility. The problems actually that I mentioned before with division deans not necessarily being familiar with all the programs that they manage would also certainly apply here. The lower compensation for faculty is such that there appears to be a consistent difficulty in many institutions with filling this chair position. No one wants it. No one wants to do it. Someone has to be forced to do it, guilted into doing it, blackmailed into doing it, and they dread it until finally they can talk somebody else, usually through bribery, into taking the job over for them. And there's this sort of like hot potato effect where everybody just wants to pass the chair on to somebody else because they don't want to have anything to do with it. Okay. I am nearly out of time, so let me summarize some of the issues that are brought up by our research of these other institutions. One thing I'll say is that there is there's a fair deal of consistency across the institutions we studied, and you can see the overlap between the different models I've kind of tried to synopsize. They don't really strike you as necessarily so different when you sort of look at them from a distance, as it were. The main question appears to be how centralized is the administration? That's really the main question here. And along those lines, we would have to say that the lack of departments at Pasadena City College is something that is unusual. And again, as I mentioned when I talked about our model, we're not alone. We're not the only college that has a division structure without departments, but overall it is a rather unusual structure, okay? Now, that being said, the rarity of the Pasadena City College system is not necessarily an argument against it, okay? I'm not trying to assert one way or another that something being common is necessarily better, and I want to be clear about that. And this is one reason, really, after the research that we did on other institutions, my research group did not ultimately come to a conclusion or an obvious recommendation about what we should do. And that's partly because, you know, it's difficult to rely on the qualitative reports of people you talk to about their college administrative structure. I mean, the reality is that any college, there's going to be some people who are going to tell you it's horrible no matter what the structure is, and they'll feel that way sincerely, and other people will say it's fine. So we couldn't really access reliable qualitative data just anecdotally through communication. So we leave recommendations to the larger research groups as a whole, and ourselves, we're sort of background, that's where we're going first. We're actually probably the most boring of all the presentations. But yeah, so things will get more exciting, I promise. The lack of departments probably lowers our cost. It is the case that colleges with departments sometimes have fewer deans than we currently have, but frequently they don't. Okay, that would frequently not be the case. And the critical question, in a sense, given models 3 and 4 here, is that if PCC moves to a system where we do have institutionalized departments structured into our college administration, how big are those departments are going to be? Are they going to basically be the divisions we have now, or will they be further subdivided into programs and departments? And that is really, seems to me, the main difference when you get beyond the terminology and all of this sort of thing that distinguishes the different colleges along the spectrum. The last thing that came up in our committee's research that I wanted to draw everyone's attention to is the fact that changes will entail growing pains. And generally speaking, more radical changes will probably result in more difficult growing pains for our institution. And this is something I would urge you to think about before making changes. Because if the current system isn't broke, the sort of classic quote that isn't broke, then why fix it? All of the colleges we investigated essentially developed their structures over time, over history, and they've made changes to them, and they have, of course, modified their systems. But generally speaking, that's an ongoing process that occurs over the long term and not extremely suddenly, partly because such changes do, in a sense, cause these kinds of growing pains. Okay? That's the end of my presentation. I know it's very broad and very general, and I think things will move from the broad to the more specific as the afternoon goes on, but hopefully that gives you guys just some food for thought. Is there any, can I answer any questions? Are there any clarifications? I've got a huge binder full of documents about colleges all over California that you can come to my office and look at with me anytime you want. Yes?
In your models 2 and 3, where there are both deans and be any more specific about the division of labor? Administrative categories?
Yeah, I had a couple of slides about that and took them out. I mean, I think when you've got deans and chairs, chairs frequently handle things that are program specific. They also do scheduling, but then they answer to deans for higher level administrative affairs, including sometimes budgets. Any budget sort of larger than an immediate program budget would be in the hands of whatever the dean or vice president that the chair is actually answered to. But there was, from what we could see, a great deal of overlap. We got mired in the whole question of duties. And the problem with the research on that is that we could find lists of what the duties were for chairs or deans at the different colleges. What they were supposed to be. Is that what's really getting done, or who's doing the work was kind of another question that was in a sense beyond our purview. But that would be the division I would say exists there. And of course it's going to vary depending on how big those departments are. A very large department simply becomes more like a division, right? How would English not be division-like? It's too large, right? But my friend is a chair of anthropology at College of the Canyons, and he manages a department of 2 full-time people and 13 adjuncts. and runs the program and does all the scheduling and tries to keep everybody happy and has to be the bad guy and all that stuff that, you know, that is done by deans here, for 20% release time. And when I asked him, is this worth the 20% release time, he said, hell no. But he believed so strongly in what he was doing because, you know, he's an anthropologist, so he believes in the program, and therefore, you know, he was happy to take the job and make sure that the program was strong, right? So that's sort of the dynamic, I think, with these little departments, actually, that you find. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned from the structure that originally chairs to system. Do we have any?
They moved to a system like ours from one that had departments, was what I said. And we heard certain things, but you know, I think centralization of the administration was sort of the main thing behind it. They had, my understanding, and I don't have firsthand experience, and it wasn't the college I did my research on, Simon. So my understanding is that there was a fair amount of faculty support behind that movement. And it wasn't something that was simply imposed on Citrus by administration, but somebody who's more familiar with the Citrus situation can probably answer that question. I don't know if anybody on my committee remembers or if anybody else is here that. Dan? Toward a PCC model as well, yeah, similar situation at Long Beach.
Yeah, and it was.
So faculty was resisting in that case?
Yes, they did.
And it has yet to be decided, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just in discussion.
Right. Yeah. And my memory is that when we talked to people at Citrus and Long Beach, they were sort of surprised in a sense because we were attempting to move in the opposite direction that they were moving in. But then maybe that's born from just being dissatisfied with whatever model you have. You know, people want to improve things, I guess. Okay, well, I'll be around all day. I will participate, and if you have other questions, I'm here at your disposal. I can send you a copy of the full report, and I'm happy to talk to anybody. Okay, thank you very much. We can keep using that. Just leave there. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you to the faculty that worked with you. When Derek initially presented this to our task team, we thanked him for the very obvious neutrality that they brought to this question in pointing out the strengths and weaknesses, and I think that still stands out to me. So now we have Stephanie Fleming from the speech department, and she is going to present on our current structure here at PCC. So welcome, Stephanie.
I know many of you already have this document, so I'll speak from the document. But just really quickly, I don't know if we're going to be as excited as Derek promised. So this is the background information. I don't know if we're necessarily the entertainment for today, but we'll see how it goes. So we were just charged, our subgroup was charged with looking at the status quo here at PCC, just so we could get a better understanding. And just to give you an idea of why our particular group was formed, on the very first night that Task Team 2 got together, the big kind of like guiding question was like, do we need to change? And if we do need to change, why? And so that's really where the conversation started. And so we thought that the best place to kind of get an answer to that particular question was to look at some of the pros and cons. And this is just a list that came directly from that meeting that night of some of the benefits to our current system and then some of the possible challenges to our current system. So just to look at a couple of the highlights from this. So without a dean, many faculty members felt that conflicts between faculty and department chairs will arise with a lack of method of resolution. And effective deans, and we stress effective deans, resolve conflict and keep peace and stability, and that's something that works well within our current system. A unifying and effective dean steering a division theme or vision works well. And I'm not going to go through and read the entire list, but looking at some of this, how our current system has fewer layers of bureaucracy, and some people felt that that was a benefit. And then some of the disadvantages of our current system was that we lack certain resources, and many faculty members have voiced multiple times that some of the lack of those resources may be directly contributed to our organizational structure. We're still kind of like deciding if, how much we feel that way. But some people noted that we need better counseling within departments or divisions for specific areas or specialties. For example, like I know that in my particular division, a lot of the advisory falls upon our dean. And of course, a dean necessarily isn't for all of the departments there, the information that you have or the ability to do that, and best effort at that. But that may be more effective for students, because that was also one of the things that we noticed from students' voice telling us things that we may need in our structure, is that they just don't know who to go to for advising outside of like the official counseling department. And so maybe, that's something that we could look at if we decided to change the structure. Let me highlight a couple of the other things. Somebody also noted that the current structure that we have creates a competitive, non-collaborative culture in terms of curriculum development, and can often create like silos, the silo effect that we've talked about often. And that without chairs, there can be conflict and competition among all of the faculty who are vying for, certain power positions, because it's not necessarily delineated. There was a note that ineffective deans may not provide consistency or good leadership, but that goes for any leadership. That was also something that was, that noted. And then having multiple chairs may make it harder to reach consensus and get action, as well as adding more unnecessary bureaucracy. So as we go through and we note all of the challenges to our current system, a lot of the research that we found is that, especially from the previous presentation, is that some of those problems don't necessarily go away just because we change the structure. And so that was something that was highlighted from all of the pros and cons to the status quo. Okay. Derek already mentioned this a little bit, but part of our task was to look at the history of chairs at PCC. And as Derek noted, our structure was consistent with that Model 4, where we had the chairs, and then the term was changed to division deans. And I found out that, so in November of 1995, the title was changed from division dean, or the title was changed to division dean. And the Courier has an article, and also the library has a lot of resources on this, including an audio of the speech that was given, as to why it should be changed. But one thing that we noted that we have to keep in mind that was really important, that it was in response to an accreditation report. And so that particular change from what we had before to the current thing that we had, now, has a lot to do with that accreditation recommendation. So that's something that we really need to keep in mind as if we suggest any changes. I should have brought my mouse. Okay, here we go. And again, if you'd like to read that article, or if you would like to hear the audio, just let me know, or the library also has it. So then what we were asked to do is to kind of get an overview, a look of what all of our, because each one of our divisions has its own unique structure. And so if we're looking at what we need, if we need to make any changes, we have to find a way to be able to find what works within each of these divisions, and then maybe find what could be improved upon within each of these divisions. And I think one of our largest challenges is that each one of the divisions is so unique and so different. And so and how many of you have this report? I know it was sent out en masse, so most of you should have this report. And if you don't have it, if you'd like a copy, just send me an email. And so what we did is we went through and we kind of tried to get a visual image of what each of the divisions look like. And this was sent out to each one of the deans, and we asked them to vet the information so we can make sure it was as accurate as possible. So for example, the Performing and Communication Arts Division. So the structures, we start with the division dean. We have a division secretary or administrative secretary too, a division clerk or an intermediate clerk. The division coordinator, so currently the dean has been granted up to 60% release time, and then he can use that release time as he sees fit. So we have multiple coordinators within the Performing and Communication Arts Division. And then you can see the different departments that work within the division, how many full-time and how many adjunct that we currently have under each one of the departments. And so most of the models will be consistent with this information, and you can go through, hold on. Some of the information, and as the information was given to me, it was given to me in different ways, and so I made sure that I was putting in the information as it was shared to me. So sometimes there were comments about some of the information. I tried to include those in the models to best inform us. So for example, if we look at VAMS, so they have an interim dean, they have a secretary to intermediate clerk, which is currently unfilled. And then they have coordinators. So they have 4 faculty with 15% release time, and then it has a list of some of their duties here. But then they also have a structure where they have to have, area heads, and then they have an art gallery. So, the needs of each one of these particular divisions, changes. And then it also has certain places have lab techs, which is something we don't necessarily need in some of the other divisions. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move through are there any specific divisions that anybody wants to look at? As I'm not going to yeah, yes ma'am. Sure. What I passed by, sorry. With English. Sorry, just a sec. Mathematics. And I suppose you have a colorful. You see, that one was sent to me. I can't claim any credit for that one. Okay, here we go. The business? Oh, it's not in there? Okay, I'll make sure it gets added. Sorry about that. I'm not sure. We were updating it, and then for some reason it's not. Sorry. Okay, thank you. Okay, so then let's move ahead to the kind of conclusions. So again, we were trying to stay neutral, but some of the conclusions that came out of the larger group after we discussed some of this information. So first of all, it's obvious that the divisions rely heavily on faculty coordinators, and from looking at the models, this was something that was really highlighted to us. The responsibilities and compensation for coordinators vary significantly, and while this may allow divisions to utilize coordinators to meet unique needs, which can be a good thing, it also allows for some faculty to take on administrative duties with little to no compensation. For example, we have one particular division where they call heads, coordinators, and they do a lot of the administrative work, but they receive absolutely no compensation for it. Or for example, the library gets absolutely no release time for any coordinators to be able to use, while the other instructional divisions do. And so it varies significantly. The role of coordinator appears to be kind of a quasi-faculty administrator kind of identity. So as one faculty member noted, coordinators do all of the work without any of the authority. And so it can be a challenge sometimes to accomplish some of the administrative tasks that are given to a coordinator because they really have no power in which to enforce, those responsibilities. Next, it is important to note that PCC explored the relationship between the accreditation and the realignment, as I was hinting to earlier. The recommendation or recommendations that may be given from our task teams could directly depend on current accreditation recommendations for organizational structures, and so that's something that we also need to pay attention to. Additionally, it's important to understand modern academic organizational models and how they compare to our current structure and to any structure that the institution might consider. So the information that's been gathered up to this point indicates that PCC could benefit from considering a more modern organizational structure that would increase communication, effectively distribute responsibility and power, and ultimately increase a sense of ownership among all groups on campus. For example, so if you look at, there are basically like 4 models of organizational structure to higher education. And if you look at those, if you look at our structure, it's more bureaucratic. So there's a very linear way in which the power structure works. However, then we have shared governance that comes in, and shared governance is a very collegial model where you disperse power, you try to put responsibility, equal responsibility on multiple groups. But those two things don't necessarily work effectively together. So in a bureaucratic system, it's very difficult for shared governance to truly be able to work as a collegial model, because then it has to kind of conform inside of a bureaucratic model. And so that may be one of the things that we need to look at, is that if we truly want to maintain a because there are pros and cons to both of those models. And if you look at both of them, some things work well in some and some things work well in the other. But from the reporting, with all of the research that we did, it seems like we're trying to force 2 models to work together. And so perhaps that's something that we also need to explore. And I'm not sure why that last paragraph is put in there. That's strange. Was there stuff added to the document? It was hour 4 on revision, so there you go. So that was primarily our task, was to just get some information to try to kind of point us in certain directions. And like I said, we were trying to remain neutral at this point, because really our task wasn't to come up with recommendations quite as of yet. So we were really about gathering the information about our current system, because I know personally I learned a lot of things about the different divisions that I had no idea. And I apologize that the one division was left out. I'll make sure that it gets added into the document. I'll send it to Matt so he can send it out. Does anyone have any questions about this particular document? Yes, sir.
Last paragraph of the report, you say you have...
Yeah, it shouldn't be there. That shouldn't be there. Okay. I'm not sure why that got put in there. I apologize. That paragraph is one of the first paragraphs, and the changes were made. Apparently it decided it liked its paragraph and didn't want to let go of it when I deleted it. I apologize. Any other questions about this? Like I said, it's primarily just information gathering at this point.
I'll make a comment, which is one of the things that we effectively do in some divisions. They're compensated, like volunteerism.
And we have divisions that actually call them department chairs. And so along with that title, you may not be fully compensated as if you were contractually a department chair, but then there is a certain amount of, referent power that comes with that particular title. All right, thank you.
Thank you. So, Deborah, nice. So our final group from Task Team 2, which was the group that was charged with coming up with innovative solutions. This is Deborah Bird from Architecture and Design Tech.
Hi, everyone. Save, don't save, save. Always save. Oh. Thanks very much, everyone. I just want to say before we start that this group, subgroup 2.3, sort of evolved out of the original conversation because on the first night, because we started looking at it as presented as an either-or kind of discussion, and we started thinking, well, perhaps there's something more to this, and we should look beyond the traditional or the given choices. So we wanted to look at models from both inside and outside academia and look for just a different outside view of the problem. Our team mainly comprised myself and Brian Tucker, with some great input from Yolanda Mackay, who is fortunately she's out on sabbatical. Unfortunately, she was also ill during part of this. So as the document that was circulated states, this is more or less the result of a couple of conversations and some reading that I've done over the course of the winter break and put together today. So the first thing we started looking at in our initial conversation was, are we asking the right question? And so from a design point of view, we started thinking about it in terms of, well, let's solve the right problem. It's not necessarily the problem that's being presented. So we started looking at, in our initial discussion, what are the real problems that we're trying to solve here at PCC? And we started looking at it in terms of what's going on at the moment. Obviously, student completion rates, which are very low. We lose over 60% of our students within 5 or 6 years. We don't know where they've gone. They haven't got a certificate. They haven't transferred. They've just vanished. We have low rates of transfer readiness. The numbers, it's like 28% within 5 or 6 years. Students who state that they want to transfer are actually prepared to do so. We have very low numbers of certificates. We have huge problems with basic skills. And we have the forthcoming issues to deal with the task force recommendations that Jeanette Mann shared with us at the Academic Senate last week, and which have had a lot and growing publicity. We have big problems with data, collecting information that will help us make these decisions. And we also have these huge looming budget constraints. So when we look at it overall, the problem is not necessarily our organisation. Our biggest problem is actually student success. And so when we start thinking about the problem from that point of view, the real question becomes, how can our organisational system achieve student success? We shouldn't be talking about traditional ideas about structure at all. We should be focusing on the problem. So we should be thinking about what outcomes do we want to achieve and how can our organisational system achieve them? What characteristics would the system have? What principles should drive its creation? How do we even know when it's working or not? And then what do we do if it's not? How do we maintain it and manage it and grow it if it is working? So when you start thinking about it from this point of view as a problem-solving question rather than an imposition of a system, which is something that I don't think anyone wants, we start to think about it differently. So let's not call it a structure. Let's think about it as a system. Like you pointed out, it becomes inherently rigid, inflexible, hierarchical, etc. We need a certain amount of structure, of course, in order to do our work, but the system is actually the thing that's going to help us get the students through successfully. Now, a few words about organisational change in general. Every piece of research that I read said that this process will be very difficult because resistance to change is inevitable. And I'm not just talking about the idea of changing from one organisational model to another. I'm talking about change in general, but the reality of the situation is the change is upon us, whether we want it or not, whether we like it or not. We simply have to maximise and make most effective and productive our response to it. Ironically, as Peter Drucker pointed out, the more successful an organisation has been in the past, the more resistant it is to change. And that's, I think, one of the things that we're dealing with. Proud past. We have had a very successful school in the past, but under the current and future pressures that we're under, we are not doing as well as we would like, and that's the reality of the situation. So we have a greater level of resistance to change. Dee Hock, who invented the system for the Visa card, which is an organisation that's larger than most medium-sized countries, came up with a few inspiring comments. He argues that the imposition of a top-down structure will not only create greater resistance in the organisation, it'll also result in an ineffective system, because you simply can't micromanage it down to the level of every single student. So his argument is you empower any organisation from the bottom up. And if we're talking about a student-driven organisation, that means we have to empower students and teachers and everyone in between. It's got to be a bottom-up type organisation. And then the change process will involve multiple changes with public and private components that will not mirror each other. Multiple reorganisations point out that the public face of the reorganisation can be very, very different to what is going on in the background. So in other words, the kinds of things that we're experiencing here are very similar to what happens in all organisations when they're attempting to deal with shifting and reorganising themselves. In fact, one study documented, according to an institutional theory model, that these change or this innovation takes place primarily or firstly through a coercive process. In other words, you're told you have to change, and you're often told how, and it's a bureaucratic top-down approach. The second phase is a mimetic process, which is where you look around to see how other successful organisations are operating and you attempt to mimic what they're doing. That's, interestingly, the phase we're at right now, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. And then the third phase, which I think is the most interesting, is the normative process, where you take that information on board, but then you develop a system that is appropriate to your own needs. And I would argue that that's essentially what's been going on in this college as well, but behind the scenes, and that's reflected in the research that Stephanie's done, which shows that even within the school we have multiple organisational systems. So the idea is to achieve this third phase, which is that manifests itself when key organisational members react to define the conditions and methods of their work so as to establish a common philosophy and to legitimate professional autonomy. And I think autonomy here is the key word. So the number one recommendation after defining the problem as student success is we need to develop our own criteria for our own organisational system. Otherwise, whatever we do isn't going to work. It's that simple. Okay, so back to Peter Drucker. When he was writing in the 1960s, during the period when the digital revolution was beginning, he identified that organisations were going to change dramatically, and they were becoming information-based organisations. And he says that information-based organisations are flattened, that is, they have the fewest layers of management, which is something we've been discussing. They're dispersed, that is, power is dispersed as far to the periphery as possible, and they're self-governing. Information responsibility drives those organisational systems. I'll send this out, by the way, this as a PDF so everyone can get this. Sorry, because the text is pretty small. But basically we ask the question, what information do I need from myself to do my job? What information do I need from others to do my job? And what do other people need from me informationally for them to do their job? And that's it. That's the primary basic currency of our organisation. So the fewest number of levels, communicating the most amount of information as quickly and efficiently as possible, all based on individual responsibility. Specialised task teams, that is, people who are drawn together for a specific problem solving. He likens it to research and development as a model. Minimal centralised control is the other feature. The primary function of management within this model is to look outward to beyond the organisation and to coordinate inward. So to coordinate the autonomous, self-organising task teams. And then the role of the task teams is to focus inward on their special area of expertise and then report outward. It's a less hierarchical organisation, and it means that competency, this is a key one, because it's a less hierarchical organisation, it means that competencies have to be rewarded at the level where the person is, because this is not necessarily a model where people are promoted upward. It actually empowers people at the level that they're at. And that's a very different idea, especially when you compare the structural disconnect between a faculty organisation, which is essentially flat, and a management organisation, which is essentially vertical, which is also something that Stephanie pointed out. So in other words, you've got to reward people for where they are, for what they're doing right now. So DHOC, Visa Guy, had a couple of other points about information-based organisations. Once again, only from the bottom up, it's the only way it can work. Equitable ownership, and that means in developing and refining the system on the go, embracing change and diversity, durability, and this is this idea that the organisation will never stop reforming itself. It's always going to keep changing whether we want it to or not. Even if we were to impose a complete top-down bureaucratic overhaul of our current organisational system, it would inevitably start to drift away from that organisation or that organisational structure as quickly as it can to find a system that works, because people are problem solvers. We have to tap that ingenuity and empower people to use it. And in that sense, everyone's got to be a leader, in the sense that even you're a leader if you're choosing to follow someone who's leading well, right? And we all know about that. Everyone's a manager. Key responsibility, you're managing yourself because your primary responsibility is informational. Your students, what do you need for them? How do you get it? And also this idea that when you're managing, you're actually managing upward. The number one person you should be managing after yourself is your superior. You need to hold their feet to the fire in order to get what you need to do your job. So it's a reversal of that. Okay, so that's from the world of business and organisation in general. In academia, there's a very long report from the Academic Senate, which was from 2004, which talked about the faculty chair model. And they essentially said that institutional success can come from widespread discussion and agreement on philosophy and structure prior to the implementation of a change. So once again, they're echoing this idea, it's got to be a bottom-up movement. Now, obviously, the Academic Senate is writing primarily about the role of faculty, but everything that I'm talked about up till this point doesn't necessarily distinguish between faculty, administration, and also, I would say, really importantly, classified staff, and all of the support people, teaching assistants, technicians, etc., who are an integral part of our organisational system, but are very often not only left out of the decision-making processes, but are essentially left out of the structure altogether. They're seen as something that is sort of often superfluous to the system. And I would argue that as faculty, we need to look beyond our own organisational system, our own collegial organisation, and I would argue that the other groups within that have an interest in the college also need to look beyond their own immediate organisational group and start thinking about this as a much larger issue that involves all of us equally. They also argue that there's a number of advantages to the faculty chair position. They talked, and I won't cover this again because it's essentially a recap of what Stephanie and Derek were talking about. There are different structures already evident. And also the biggest issue, which is that there is such a range of titles and job descriptions across all the different colleges that we really can't accurately pin down exactly what a faculty chair versus a dean is in many situations. So the advantage of the faculty chair model, as far as the Academic Senate paper goes, is this idea of collegiality, cooperation, egalitarianism, shared decision-making, etc. They also argue that another advantage of the faculty chair model is that faculty are more inclined to work across disciplines and actually have more in common with faculty chairs from other departments, divisions, programs, whatever. And that they become also effectively a conduit between faculty and administration if the situation's working well. So it can be a positive model, but there's also a lot of potential problems or issues that have to be dealt with. Conflicts of interest within your division, tribalism, if you like, the disinterest of faculty, of many faculty in assuming the leadership role, personal conflicts within programs and divisions, the loyalty to the institution versus your loyalty to your own discipline. Problems of maybe identifying problems with fellow faculty but not feeling empowered or responsible to administer discipline in that situation. The problem of the size of the institution, etc. There's also some contractual issues too, because you find that a person who is involved in the C&I process, which is faculty driven, if they are also in a faculty chair role, then where does their role fit within the C&I process? And once again, also with the budget. Also, faculty chairs have been reluctant to address issues of diversity in hiring in the past, etc. The recommendations are a rotating position elected, that the faculty chair be regarded as a colleague rather than a manager, that there be strong levels of accountability, that there be fully funded training for anyone taking a faculty chair position, that the position be dispersed or shared equitably, that there should be compensation and there should be release time. There should also be a protection for a faculty chair to voice opinion without negative consequences, given that a person who's in a rotating position may only be there for a couple of years and will eventually have to return to the trenches, if you like. And the major thing is we have to work really hard to avoid an idea of an us and them kind of culture. Okay. A couple of other options, and I like this one because by this time I'm just dragging all my baggage along with me. Okay, one of the most interesting or thorough studies was from Clarissa Craig, and she essentially aggregated a whole bunch of earlier studies on community colleges. So she was looking at up to 3,000 institutions that responded to surveys. She said the community college is really, the mission is so specific that with the emphasis on career and transfer, it makes the leadership in the chair position absolutely critical to institutional success. So we are different from four-year universities because we have these, only have people for 2 years, in theory, 2 years at a time, and we're pushing to get people transferred as quickly as possible. Being down closer to the ground where the classes and the students are really makes a difference. And she sees the key problems in community colleges that they are mostly organised for they're mostly organised for the convenience of the institution rather than for the potential of the pedagogical mission. So once again, it's backing up this idea that we should be organising the school around the students' needs. The system should evolve from those goals. We should be looking at manageable organisational units, and that may differ across departments, as we've already seen. We can mix together we can mix disciplines together for administrative and economic efficiency where appropriate. We don't have to make a single one-size-fits-all. So this size problem can be mitigated to a good degree, and we have to listen to everyone. Heterogeneous culture, all voices need to be heard. There are other problems with the role of the faculty chair. The difficulty of equating set standards, responsibilities, etc., for the job. And she defines the faculty chair as someone who has daily contact with faculty, students and administrators, and who has responsibility of assuring quality for the academic unit. So once again, she's focusing on the student. She says it's an ambiguous and complex role. You're both at once an advocate for the department, and you're also an agent for the administration. And I'm sure she meant that in a positive way. There's also a problem that people who have come out of who have spent most of their time in academia aren't necessarily thinking beyond the role that they find themselves in. So it can be narrowing. And then the biggest problem, I would argue, is that middle management is not adequately rewarded or with professional development in order to do their job effectively. So what does the effective faculty chair look like? Fostering good teaching is what it comes down to. Maintenance of faculty morale, recruitment faculty and selection of faculty, communication, and updating curriculum courses. She lists, she has an extensive list of strong leadership characteristics, which are motivational, personal skills, communication skills, that sort of thing. But she says that the chief way that we know whether a faculty chair and this would apply to any system that we come up with, the way we know whether a person is actually functioning well within that position, other than the flow of information and the outcome, the data, would be to use a competency model that should be applied. And fundamental to that is the idea of promoting success of all students. So everything needs to be driven by that basic criteria. Good communication skills, once again, cooperative, ethical, maintains external relationships that nurture diversity and success. She also talks about professionalism as someone, the competency model is extending beyond the program or the department within which the person works to a much broader vision of the institution at large, along with these others. And then the last model I thought was an interesting one. I haven't found if it's been implemented, but it was a proposal back from 1998, so it's a little older. But once again, it came up as a student-centred and prioritised model, developing a partnership between the student and the institution. And these researchers were working with the idea that we should be using essentially a customer service model, with the student being the customer. And that we should develop a cohort which involves a teaching team from various disciplines, with an administrator, with support services, and a service department rep. So in other words, everyone from the building manager to the faculty member to the student and the counsellor are all grouped together in a team around that cohort of students. So it's a much more dispersed, networked, with very small clusters. It achieves some of the other qualities that were described earlier. It minimises the management layers, it decentralises, minimises paperwork, requires a lot of training, of course, but it also integrates the academic department with the facilities and the administration to a level that no one else that I read about was discussing. Team, there's a program coordinator who is essentially coordinating with the building manager, or, they call it a building manager, but it's essentially the physical resources of the college, etc. And as it goes. I don't want to go into too much detail. One thing here, though, is that the program coordinator answers to the vice president, who reports directly to the president. So we're talking about a very, very flattened level there. So finally, I would argue that we need to restate the question, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? And I think, once again, the problem is student success. I think we're in a climate where, unless we develop an organised and cooperative response across all of the organisation within our institution, I think we run the risk of having more changes imposed upon us that we would be unwilling to accept. So that would be the response. And I would say that if there was one step to go further now, it would be to think about what the criteria might be that we would be looking for any system that we develop for ourselves. And I would suggest that we would base it on our institutional outcomes, our goals, develop ideas of, clear lines of communication, maximise support and engagement from all participants, maximise autonomy of everyone who's participating. I spoke to a professional administrator in Australia fairly recently, and she said when they had a major reorganisation in the 1990s, it drove everyone crazy, because everyone was so used to going to the person above them saying, what should I do? Can I do this? And they would constantly be redirected back to a very straightforward list of principles and criteria. And they were told, use that criteria to make your decision. If you are making your decision based on that data and that criteria, you're doing the right thing. And it was very, very hard initially, but it completed the reorganisation of the university. And this was at a time where they actually took 7 different institutes of advanced education and merged them together into one university. So they basically didn't have time to micromanage it. So everyone basically got the checklist and was told, go do it. Yeah. And they're only now looking at another reorganisation now, and so that was 17 years ago. So the system that they implemented was robust and workable for 17 years before it needed another overhaul, which I thought was pretty good. Okay. So minimise centralised controls, maximise specialised task teams, make it flexible so it can continue to change. And we have to integrate whatever we do with our new information management system that's coming in. So we can't do this in isolation. And we have to be responsive to change and reward the successes of the people who are doing well at every level. So, and then we can all go home and rest in our chair. Okay, any questions at this point? Simon?
For putting student success in the very focus, so thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yes. Let's take a 10-minute break. So, guys, we're going to start the presentations from Task Team 1, and we're going to kick it off with Joy Britton, who is an Upward Bound math science specialist. She is going to give a presentation on organizational change. Thank you.
Well, that and several other things. So task team 2 was kind of given the responsibility of 2 parts. The first part was to look at literature and to do kind of a mini literature review. And then the second part would be to expand that literature review for more in-depth information and then design what we've learned from the literature review as a possible solution. So what Deborah had just spoken to you about actually was wonderful because it really ties in to what I'm going to be speaking about. So we looked at 14 different books and articles regarding organizational change. What the team should be looking at in terms of answering the question of alignment or realignment. We looked at the difference between first-order change and second-order change, how that fits in with the mission of PCC, and what do we want to portray to the college and the community. We then reviewed different change models. So when Deborah was talking about the normative and so forth, it fits into these different change models: the evolutionary change model, the teleological, life cycle, political, social cognition, cultural, and combined. And then we reviewed the strengths and criticisms of each model, and then we also reviewed the principles of change, and then what should be our next steps. Because we really wanted to take this on a step-by-step basis. We didn't want to go into it without knowing exactly why we were doing this, for what reason, and what did we want to accomplish. So looking at the structural realignment through process, and I know it's a little bit small, we have our systems thinking up on top, and that goes into providing the networks that we need to have, encouraging the dialogues, the knowledge management, which is what we need to make sure that we continue with that dialogue, to make sure that everybody is aware of what we all are doing so that there are no silos that we seem to keep on having. And then, of course, the evolution and, most importantly, the reflection, the evaluation. So this is a typical realignment through a process standing. What's the rationale behind this? Well, the rationale is that it's going to provide PCC an organizational structure to emerge organically from the existing structure. One of the things that we were also talking about is going from that bottom up. And the only way to do that is to emerge it organically. To provide an environment for change that represents both the PCC's tradition, because we did not want to lose that, but also the desire for innovation. So how do we connect? How do we bring those synapses together so that we keep our tradition and yet we move to an innovative process? Provide a timeline and an evaluation process that guarantees continuous improvement. We know that process is a continuous movement. It's not, okay, we're going to do one thing and we're going to hold on and then that's going to stay. There has to be continuous evaluation. There has to be continuing processes to work through to make sure that if anything needs to be tweaked, that we have that evaluation to tweak it to make that process even better. And then, of course, provide that strong link between the dynamic structure and the accreditation planning and reporting. We wanted to make sure that that was also connected so that we're not basically reinventing the wheel when in a couple of years we've got to do this accreditation report, and we want to make sure that we're following through on that. So we came up with a couple of options. One is, of course, is the traditional pattern, which is the dean going down into the faculty. And then the second option would be the dean, which we would have a chair. And these terms are just terms. We don't have to call them that. We can call them whatever we want. The team that we're working with, and I should say that, so I do apologize. The team that the Group 1, Section 2 team, you might want to say, besides myself, was Russell DeFiore, Valerie Foster, both from Natural Sciences, AC Pinella from Communications, and then our student reps, one was Simon Fraser, and then Amelia Mitchell. So the terms that we developed in terms of deans and chairs and faculties, those were just words. If we need to change them, we didn't have a certain structure in terms of the actual terming or the naming of these areas of responsibility. So option 2 would deal with the chair, with the dean, and then there would be a chair that would then go down to the faculty. And that would be groups of 8 to 12 faculty organized around a chair of their choice. And this is where it gets really interesting, because it is their choice, and we're going to discuss this a little bit further. Option 3 deals with a dean, and that dean then is directly, below the dean is a faculty committee. Also, once again, groups of 8 to 12 faculty organized as a collective with no chair, and that collective is distributed. So how does that relate back to this organizational change? Well, one of the things, and we looked at, besides looking at Drucker, so that was really good, we also looked at Adriana Kazar. And so that's where these different models of the teleological, the social cognition, and looking at the strengths and weaknesses, which basically was already presented to you by Deborah, but looking back to the traditional pattern, if we look at that model, it's kind of like an evolutionary model. So the activity basically is the observation of the environment, but we have a competing force, and that is the external environment. What's happening externally to change internally, because we can have this wonderful college, but as we all know, if we're in a budget crisis and we don't have that money coming in, then we have that external force having us to make decisions that we may not want to make, but we have to make. And then, of course, the concern on that option 1 is that there's little human agency. It's a direct linear line. Is that something that we want, and how do we deal with that? Option 2 is more of the social cognition model. So the activity in terms of that option 2 would be individuals facilitating change. So you have it from that organic state doing the changing. But once again, the competing force is the external environment. And then the concern with this model, with the social cognition, is sometimes, not always, if the model is done correctly, then you don't have these concerns. But there is a concern that this particular model ignores the values and the emotions. Any type of change, as much as we want to be as non-biased, it provides emotions. It could be why, it could be anger, it could be fear, it could be, kind of isolation. So sometimes this social cognition model forgets about the emotions that comes about with any type of change. So the model 3 deals with the cultural model, and the key activity is the collective process. So once again, it's definitely organic, but it's by choice, but it's very collective. The competing force, though, is oversimplification. If we don't watch ourselves, then what we think is going to work is not going to work, because we haven't taken the time to really go through the process, look at all of the potential strengths and weaknesses to follow through. And then, of course, the concern is the plasticity of people. And what I mean by that is that we forget sometimes that as these groups of faculty come together, we forget sometimes that there may be other people that's involved, such as those that deal with the physical well-being of the buildings, those that deal with student services, those that deal with other classified positions. So those were the 3 organizational models that we were looking at. So if we took this last model, which is what we're looking at, there are several responsibilities that we want to look at. So what would be the responsibility of the faculty? Well, the first responsibility is that they would choose one of these 3 organizational options that they want to participate in. Just like now, where we have kind of different mini structures within the divisions, there may be a possibility that we can kind of continue that depending upon which departments or divisions want to get together and how well it works, because each division and department kind of works differently depending upon their full-time tenured faculty plus their adjuncts and then all of their support staff. Those choosing option 2 or 3 need to find 8 to 12 faculty of like mind to work with and develop their proposal. So these teams, which I think is really important, can be multidisciplinary and should be collected by some rational standard. For an example, maybe a team of 8 to 12 STEM. Faculty, maybe based on contextual learning, maybe faculty coming together, so the different faculty that have to deal with basic skills, social justice, health science, whatever. We're leaving it up to the faculty. Teams can be discipline focused, okay? So not only can be the interdisciplinary, but they also could be discipline focused. So there'll be 8 to 12 maybe faculty within the English division that would work together. And they also need to have some role in determining the dean that they report to. So they would go to the dean to say, you know, we want to do this collective. Are you willing to work with us to do this collective? The faculty choosing option 2 and 3 also must abide by all deadlines as well as policies and procedures regarding their proposals and the management of their teams. One of the things that we talked about is that because change, particularly second order change, which is that long lasting change, tends to be very messy, tends to be chaotic at points, we want to be able to do this as a pilot program, and just in a little bit I'll show you the timeline of what we're looking at this. So this would be kind of a pilot program where faculty together. So it wouldn't mean that every single faculty member on this campus would have to do this, would have to choose option 2 or 3, but they have a choice, and I think that's the important aspect. So then within the Structural Innovation Committee, basically is kind of the committee that would be overseeing this type of pilot program. Their responsibility would be clearly defining the 3 options for faculty and really making sure that that communication gets spread throughout the whole community. Developing a criterion for approving the proposals, developing the methodology, and then also I think just as important is working with the accreditation committee to link the innovation of the structure with the planning, evaluation, and reporting that the accreditation committee is going to have to be doing in just a little bit. And then work, of course, with the deans to develop the policy and procedures for option 2 and 3 teams. We're sticking with 2 and 3 because that's where the innovation will come about. The option 1 is the traditional way of what we've got now. Responsibility of deans. So what do the deans deal with? Well, they're developing the alignment of deans that can accommodate both the traditional disciplines and then these interdisciplinary team management. They would work with the Structural Innovations Committee to determine the policy and procedures for those that are opting for group 2 and 3, and they would develop an evaluation plan from the pilots for an administrative perspective, because we want to make sure that this develops into something that, if possible, can be long-lasting, that will work well, so that we don't have to kind of refigure ourselves every 2 to 3 years. The role of the student. So the role of the student would be to participate in all committees when possible. One of the nice things that we had was we had 2 student representatives, Simon Frazier and Amelia Mitchell, come in that put in their aspects from the student point of view, that gave us some really good insight of what we need to be looking at. And then they also need to develop an independent evaluation to guide this structural process. So it's not going to be just a one-factor flat area, but we're looking at a whole aspect. We're looking at the classified, we're looking at faculty, we're looking at administration, we're looking at students. And then, so this is the proximal timeline of what if this would go through, what we would look at. So this spring, we would provide the resources to the faculty on organizational change. We don't want to just say, faculty, okay, organize yourself into groups of 8 and 12, when they're not even wondering, what's all this about? And so we want to make sure that the research that we did gets put out to the faculty so they understand the theory behind what we're doing. We don't want to just go ahead and do the process without that theory. Division meetings to review the EMP and the criteria. The faculty chooses one of these 3 management options, and then those in option 2 and 3 can organize in communities of 8 to 12. The reason why we did 8 to 12 is that through our research, we found that you don't want to have a group larger than 12, because once you get past that 12 mark, that 12-person mark, you start losing the communication availability, you start losing the input that needs to come through from all members of this committee. And so we figured an 8 to 12, but you don't want it a small one, so an 8 to 12 is basically the optimal committee organization. Let's see, and then of course committee reviews and approves pilots. The summer, faculty selected by the committees meet together, organize and work out the details with the deans, and then the fall is when they actually start it. So the fall of 2012, which is when they start this pilot. The students would do a mid-pilot evaluation that would go through AS, but then also would be helped through the faculty. There was counting for contractual duties, so we know we have to deal with a lot of the contractual situations and the shared governance. We would complete the development evaluation and then the deployment of the first pilot programs. So if this happens, we have the time to really develop it well, to make sure that we have the understanding behind what we're doing and why we're doing it, so that when we do it, we can go forth and there won't be any questions. And then, of course, Spring 13 would be the post-pilot student evaluation, the post-pilot faculty evaluation, and the post-pilot administration evaluation. And we wanted to make sure that we hit all three sections so that we know how is it working for the students. Are students really understanding that this group of 8 to 12 faculty report to the dean? If they've got a problem and they can't get it within the faculty, they know which dean to report to. So it may be a science faculty, but the science faculty may be reporting to a communications dean or an English dean, because that's in the group. So we wanted to make sure that. We want to make sure that the faculty feel comfortable with this. And then, of course, how is in terms of administrative abilities? Are we really making sure that we're getting this information across? Has it become much more of a problem because of that changeover and because we have these different structures of option 1, 2, and 3, and so forth? And then, of course, determine the best practice for faculty within the disciplines and cross disciplines. Because with every trial period, we're going to get things that didn't work and things that worked really well that we want to continue on. So we want to look at those things that continue on. Fall 2013 and beyond is to work with administration and accreditation, because we know that's going to be coming up. And then, of course, the continual assessment. Considerations. One of the things that Deborah talked about was to do this kind of I don't want to say self-enclosed, because that almost sounds like a silo again, but do this inclusive aspect so that, and she talked about this too, would be counseling should think about going into these department-specific or course discipline models to better assist students, so that with every group of 8 to 12 faculty, there'll be somebody from the counseling department to work with them, to work with the students, so that everything kind of flows naturally. We know we have to deal with compensation and release time to get these groups together. Protecting faculty with choice and with the evaluation. We're very cognizant about what happens if we've got a new faculty that need to be evaluated. What do we do with that, and how do we deal with that? And so that's why we're giving everybody a choice, because we've got new faculty that needs to be evaluated in the fall. They may not want to be with one of those cross-disciplinary teams. They may want to stick with the traditional, so that they can get through that evaluation process and then move on. Allegiance of deans to specific divisions or potential colleges, and of course the equitable number of departments and faculty cooperatives to provide the best data. So we want to make sure that those choosing 2 and 3 are not doing just within one department or one division, that there really is kind of an equal access, equal opportunity for faculty to go ahead and work with this. And then dealing just with the evaluation, discussion at division meetings, we can suggest ways in which the proposed models will change the ability to be productive, because that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to make sure that we're as productive as possible so that we can deal with the student success. We can't deal with student success if we ourselves as administrators, as faculty, as classified are not productive to our best ability so that we can help the students who are here. And then, of course, the full productability can only be measured via long-term results. So we know that the pilot is a pilot, and that's what it is. But we can also look at some things that best practices from that pilot that we may want to go on. The surveys to be distributed both during the pre and the post restructuring. Let's see, and then the criteria, which are student-focused, and you'll see what those criteria are. And those criteria are based on the criteria that one of our sub-teams also worked on, which was absolutely student-focused. Looking at each division can submit 2 or 3 questions that they want to see in the survey, so that it's not, once again, it's not just biased against one division or one department. Faculty and student surveys will have multiple questions for each criterion. And then AS, of course, as I said, will be responsible for the student surveys. So these are the criteria that we looked at in terms of leading to the goals and outcomes. So we talked about the students need to be informed at all stages of their academic development. And as you can see, you can read it, the movement between programs and tracks should be fluid. Progress through basic skills should be as brief as possible so that we minimize exit points, and I know that's one of the things that TLC is working. How do we get these options 2 and 3 teams to really think about that? Faculty need access to innovative pedagogy. Faculty need to respond dynamically to environmental changes. We know that this could be great, but if we don't have the ability to do that because of financing, this is all going to be moot. So we realize there's a lot of concerns and different structural procedures that we have to take in consideration. So I think that is it. Yeah. Any questions?
2 questions. Number 1,
Absolutely. I sent it to Matt late because I was away. So I will definitely, actually Matt and Lynn have it so they can send it out to whomever, or I can send it to you personally.
including the effects of unclassified staff that are involved in the Department of Administration.
Yes. We did. We looked at every single aspect of every single employee as we were looking at this and how they would be merged into this process.
How do you imagine that it might play out? Have you floated this idea with people and you've had sort of response? How do people react?
We haven't floated it outside of our subcommittee. Within the subcommittee, we looked at different possibilities. I mean, we looked at, well, let's see about, this team, or what about this team, and, how it would get played out in a couple of years. And that's why we really need to look at considerations in terms of those who are new faculty, those that are adjunct faculty. And that's why we considered it as a pilot. And not necessarily as the definitive option, but as a pilot option, so that those that want to stay within that traditional range, they can stay within that traditional range. Those that want to group themselves together within the department or within the division can do it, or do that cross multiple disciplines. So, no, we haven't done it because this is what we're working with. Sorry. Exactly. And one of the things that, and I'm sure that you've seen it too, in terms of organizational change, is that it is disruptive. It gets very messy. But that if people are willing to work through that chaos, what comes out at the end is so much better than where they were in the beginning. So. Any others? Great. Well, this is my wonderful segue. Because what are we going to do while we're doing this pilot?
So Amy Ulmer, our Dean of English, is going to be presenting on the interim plan.
Okay, how do I get this to the top? Can you bring that to the top for me?
Absolutely.
Starting with Plan B? No. While we're waiting for this, I want to say that Joy gave a Task Team 1 subgroup A, B, and C, whatever we are, a great lesson on organizational change. So it was very helpful. Okay. No, we're still at the wrong one. Yeah, I want to get to the beginning. Going all the way to the top where it says beginning. There we go, in the intro. Okay. All right, so the group that I was on, I call us a subcommittee, included Yoshi Yamato, Jose Cortez, Paul Wilkinson, Joe Footner, Cindy George, and Simon Fraser. And we weren't all at all the meetings, but we communicated quite a bit. And what was interesting about our group is some of the group are under interim deans, some under quasi-permanent deans, and some under a division with only a faculty coordinator. So we had a nice cross-section of the way the college is organized now. And we basically responded to Dr. Roach's question at our last big meeting, well, what do we do in the interim while we're waiting for the college to come to some kind of consensus about how we should be organized? So in the interim, we came up with a plan. So if I can figure out how to move this, oh, here we go, this one here. Will that do it? Okay. All right. So these proposals address, as I just said, how we can meet the needs of the college and continue to work for student success until consensus has been reached. So here's Plan A, and it's pretty straightforward. The following areas would continue with their ongoing permanent deans, and permanent's in quotation marks because we have a yearly contract, as you all know. So this would include performing and communication arts, health sciences, natural sciences, English, languages, and social sciences. Obviously, if anybody retired from that group in June, they would be different. But for now, this is what we're looking at. The following areas would continue with their current interim deans, and that would be math, visual arts, and media studies, assuming those current deans, Joe, are doing a good job. And Charlie, you back there? Okay, so the Shatford Library, as many of you know, Dean Marianne Lawn will be retiring in the spring. So we believe that for the Shatford Library, there should be a director of the library. This would be an interim management position, but not a dean's position. Engineering and technology, business and computer information systems, and the CEC would be reallocated. This is where we get a little wild and crazy. Academic courses would go logically into aligned areas. For example, business math would go into the math division, business English would go to English, etc. Courses that are traditionally considered trades, such as courses leading to certificates and workforce development, would be housed in a new area, which we called Career and Tech Education. This would combine parts of E&T, business and computer technology, and the CEC under one dean, interim or otherwise. So that's Plan A. So what we see for Plan A in the good is that it provides continuity for areas that are currently functioning efficiently from our group's perspective, realigns some areas, so instead of having 11 divisions, we would be down to 9 areas plus the library. So that would be fewer than the current configuration. All areas would have management representatives reporting to the Vice President of Instruction, and it provides a place for the CTE classified staff. Here's the bad. It breaks up 2 areas. Joe, you said you fixed that S. 2 areas, and moves faculty into a variety of areas that they may not be so comfortable in. And it's a challenging learning curve as the new CT area is created. Okay. We also felt in this configuration that we just talked about, Plan A, that there may need to be faculty coordinators allocated as necessary, and that there needs to be more consistency across divisions as to what these coordinators do and some more greater definition. That's Plan A. I'll give you time for questions in a minute. Plan B is, continue the existing division structure, reappoint interim deans in math and VAMS for an additional year, and appoint interim deans for the E&T and business areas. The good on that is there's consistency across the college, management representative for each area, and it seems to work. And the bad is it does not address the Board of Trustees' call for a change in instruction. And I believe that's it. So Joe and I will take questions. Dan.
Yeah, I noticed
I think we were looking to have fewer deans, that the library director would still have the authority to run the college. I mean, not the college, the library. Well, talk to Mary Ann, she does. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering also whether it would be nice to survey faculty
Why we're having the meeting today. Yes, Deborah.
My concern the issue of potential crossover for students who are looking at starting with, say, a CTE certificate but then want to also pursue transfer. Do you see that there's a way to deal with that pathway for students?
Committee members to help me out here. Yeah.
Right, so I could answer that it's an interim plan while
Right.
we're doing this research.
Right.
So it's not meant to be permanent, it's meant to
Right.
An educational plan include not only CTE academic courses like this. I did that. Went from taking academic courses to CTE certificate back and then graduating transfer at the same time. So it's, and they are building Associate of Science and Associate of Academic degrees that integrate the CTE program.
One thing I want to just add on to that is that students have told you don't really see CTE as being something other than academia. So when you think about rating, whether a student's going to be taught in the CTE area or when they're following the ed plan, they're going back and forward, they're doing whatever, it's just a school for a student. So these sort of esoteric conversations that happen within the management structure, but as far as the student point of view, it's all school.
I think that's a really interesting point. And I think for me, when I think of what is the reason behind group and CTE, I always go back to the idea that, or the question of, is there something unique to that type of program that you need leadership that will apply specifically to all those types of programs? And I don't know the answer to that, but that's what I.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Well, Matt and I don't know if I should say this for Matt, we would talk after our groups would meet, and we were kind of amazed at the parallel tracks that we were running and all the different intersections, and we were so pleased to finally have this opportunity for you all to hear it as well, and hopefully you've seen some of these intersections. So now is our time to think about what we just heard, how they relate, how they don't, and think about our clarity and also our next steps. What do we do next now that we've shared this information? So we could spend a little time at your tables just talking about the different connections that you see, particularly because I see your group sort of task team 1 and task team 2, you've segregated yourselves. Silos. Anyway, you could take a few moments to think about what you heard from the other task team and think about what questions that you have and what you think are similarities or differences, concerns, and then so maybe take 5-10 minutes to think about that, and then we can regroup as a whole and share some of those out. Would that work? Body language? Yes? Okay. All right. So let's look. You can always tell a teacher can tell when it gets quiet. Then I know you're done. But let's take initially, how about 20 after? And if you take more time, we'll just keep going on, okay? Okay. So we thought we'd do a real quick share out of the 3 tables, just any big aha, inspirations, concerns, whatever, and maybe go with the back table first.
All right.
Okay.
We're already halfway through spring break. We need a little bit more time. We're proposing to take Plan B, things as they are, so we can take a look at the possible reorganization down the line a little bit. Taking the Plan A and trying to look at the care system is really a little too much.
Wow, I want to let everybody share. But you already identified two great things. Great. Anybody else at that table? That's good ahas? All right. How about to my left?
That the students are going to be sort of put on pathways and transfer majors, and that's going to become a more and more structured part of the student experience where they may be required to be in a program. And thinking that if that's the reality for the students, then administrative changes should be tailored to make that more effective and perhaps built around that. But that's something that's in process, so I think I'd like to slow the mix down myself as well.
We're doing a little research. That comes right out of the student task force recommendation to declare a degree by the end of the third semester.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the future. It seems like maybe we haven't considered that closely enough how we should be realigned. That's what the students, that's the students, right? That's what they have to do.
May not be decisioned, but certainly it would be what the students have been told that they will have to do, I guess. Right, right.
But then when we started to think about it in terms of the structured pathways approach, we started to think that maybe an organisation like that could be interesting because it could be based around a core of people who are within a pathway, and then there could be, a proportion, a small proportion of people within that team that are, we were thinking of it as sort of the fuzzy edges, like the other cross-disciplinary, collaborative, curricular elements that go into really strengthen and enrich a pathway. So maybe there could be, maybe it's a system of electives or, and then there's another one that suggested too that it could be we were talking about it, and this is a professional development layer. That could actually become a professional development layer in the school also, teams of people. So there are a number of really interesting applications of that. We're just weren't sure about how it fits in here and now, and how it holds itself accountable as a system.
Just the pragmatics of implementing that option 1, 2, 3 of the 8 to 12 groups, the concept, could bring about a lot of positive things, but none of us here can really figure out how on a huge PCC level as overall.
Once again, you guys are right on it, and I have to say when I first heard the proposal, my head was spinning too, but yeah.
It's a much longer.
I think, as she said, the organic, but also the evolutionary, right? Yeah. It doesn't just happen. What we saw over and over again, and you brought it in the presentation, is that change cannot just happen. If it does, it's disastrous. It has to evolve, and it's a process, and we both had system over structure, right? So similarities there. Yes?
Oh my God, how are we going to do this? Competing factions, and how do I schedule someone who's in a cohort of me who's in anthropology, because I know Derek is going to come my way. And
you already made that clear.
And Joy did point out, and I think this needs to be emphasized, that this was a pilot, and it was limited. Just not all faculty could opt in right away, and there'd be criteria that would be
very, very slow.
Small and controlled.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing. Christopher brought up something interesting. Somehow the kinesiology fell off the earth here. And the subcommittee believes that we're splitting the health classes into health sciences, and then the activity classes go where activity classes have to go. We didn't really try to figure that part out.
Well, again, great segues. And I do want to say that what was presented by Task Team 1, they
had done a lot of research, but we made them cut it down. And we got to a point where we said, okay, let's try to apply it. And so both of them cut short. And the reason why Task Team 2 went first is that we allowed you to present all the research. Joy had a very, very long presentation about, she did really in-depth research on this. But we wanted to try to say, okay, let's just play with the idea of trying to apply this. So it's just a first stab at it. So having acknowledged that, one of the things that we think would be an obvious next step would be for us to start to intermingle and resort ourselves into two new groups, and you've already, beginning with Dan, identified those two groups. One would be a group that would look at and investigate more thoroughly what a stopgap interim approach would be, because we heard some questions already, why did you do this and why did you do that? So to spend a little bit more time, again with both task team folks involved this time, thinking about this interim plan. And then another group thinking a little bit more thoroughly, troubleshooting, whatever, this idea of how could we activate while we research, but also research through experimentation, some sort of different organizational system. So that's what we're going to, and you all were sort of saying, but I want to know more, we need to think about more, and that obviously involves different timelines and all that kind of stuff. Seems like we all have a firm foundation, similar foundations, and now maybe we need to kick the can around a little bit more on these two kind of proposals, one the interim and one how we continue to do this bottom-up growth and think about how we can study and pilot something. Does that seem to make sense?
So can I paraphrase to make sure I'm understanding?
I may not understand.
Two groups, one looking at what the proposal was and one looking at the interim. So the proposal were two components. And the other one was the interim plans with AFD. So you're saying that two groups of people would re-examine those, make sure they, for example, the timeline has enough time built into it, start fourth option or tweak option 3. That would be work.
Even who choose to work on the interim plan. The interim plan is looking at plan A and B and thinking about those two and do they need to be tweaked. Just your presentation. So one would be a group around what Dean Ulmer presented. Okay? So looking at what the college should do in the short period of time, right? Which means a really short timeline because fall is upon us, right? We're already halfway through spring, I think, or close to it. So a group that wants to look more quickly, or more deeply, but quickly into a stopgap solution. We already have one out there. It was proposed today, Plan A and Plan B, but we might want to think about it more thoroughly and give a little bit more rationale and background because we have to present to the Planning and Priorities Committee. I know some of them were here, but our next step really is to think about these things a little bit more thoroughly and then formally present to them, right? So maybe we could flesh out a little bit more interim plan, and then another group would take, in essence, what Joy has presented and said, well, we got to tweak those options, or we need to add to those options, or we need to cut that option and add this option, and change the timeline. Anyway, that would sort of take, how do we do this bottom-up investigation of how we reorganize and try it out in the process?
I thought we were doing it after this meeting. I'm a little confused.
Recording that.
Two more planning and priority meetings. One would be April 2nd or April 30th. I don't think we're in the position to make any formal recommendations by April 2nd, but we absolutely need to do it by April 30th because we only have a couple more, we got, 6 weeks left after that. So this is a short timeline. Remember, we're just the research group, but we've just shared our ideas. Now we want to come together as a single unit and create some recommendations that we formally will present to P&P. Right? The reason why we invited them to be here today is so that they would have a little bit stronger foundation on what we're basing our recommendations on. Does that make sense?
We're going to try to get it all together today.
I would think that that's really, that's got to be done.
Right.
So we don't have any, it would have to be done next month. It would have to be done by the end of the month, if not by the middle of the month. So this is again, but most of us, and I know I'll speak for our group, we did this stuff very quickly for the most part. It's sort of like pulling a Band-Aid off real quick. It doesn't hurt quite as much. So does anybody, should we gravitate towards the room? The people who are interested in the interim plan, what Dean Ulmer presented, working on that, fleshing that out, maybe gravitate over here where Dean Ulmer is sitting. And those who are more interested into the longer term, looking into reorganization, change in that way, gravitate to this end. And if you're just tired and want to opt out, thank you for your service. We really appreciate it.
What I know we want to how we have left is maybe to talk about all of those changes suggested about throwing out all of the problems with this model so that we can kind of take a look at it on our own and when we come back again, we'll be able to go ahead and strategize how to work. What you wrote out, I think originally, what Matt sent out was the organizational change. This is, understand this is the organizational change. That's what we did. And then what Matt just sent out today is a summary report for task one. So that kind of gives you, what I did was kind of really condensed my first two PowerPoints for the task group and then added this last one.
That's kind of where I'm so tired of
Let's take a 10-minute break.
Focusing on what they're doing for their structure system. What are the responsibilities that
And then we'll send you,
that need to be done?
we'll send the whole task
And who
team
should
what
be
we
doing it?
discussed here. So
What
everybody
area should be doing
and then I'll
it?
send
Despite
you out.
whether it's a person, a committee, a clown, what exactly, how to organize on task, and then after that, everybody should be going into what their position.
Yes.
What do you think, like this thing?